All right, getting into some stories on Afghanistan here. We got some updates, and this is something that we'll continue to cover on conflicts of interest. Is what happens as Trump is apparently looking to wind down the Afghan war. There's two things going on related to Afghanistan. Some of it is happening in the country of Qatar, and those are the talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And then there's the actual fighting and war going on in Afghanistan, and neither of these things seem to be going particularly well. Two stories here from antiwar.com. The first by Dave DeCamp. Afghanistan, over 100 killed in deadliest clashes since intra-Iran Afghan talks begin. And Dave estimates 57 Afghan government fighters and 80 Taliban fighters reportedly being killed across the country. Looking at those numbers, and this isn't something I was able to measure for sure, and oftentimes the reports of Taliban casualties seem pretty inflated because it's just the Afghan government giving the numbers, and then the Taliban, of course, always claim like 2 of their soldiers died or something like that. So I don't think that the reporting on those numbers are ever very accurate, but this is some of the deadliest fighting we've seen in Afghanistan this year, and is coming just weeks after official talks begin between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And then the other story we have here is from Jason Ditz, which is Taliban and Afghan government far apart on basic issues at talks. And so it seems like bad news all around here. Will, where do you want to start with this? The clashes in Afghanistan?
I suppose we could start with the talks. I think we can get into the clashes in just a sec. Like the last time we had talked about this on the show, there was very little reporting on the actual negotiations. They'd kind of just started, and there was some delays and stuff. But now, as you're pointing this Jason Ditz story, like we are getting a little bit of information, and unfortunately, it's not sounding too great. Right off the bat. The story that Jason based his on was at Reuters, and this Reuters piece, they talked to some negotiators and some diplomats who were there in Qatar. And they're saying, like you said, the Taliban and the government are still far apart on a lot of basic issues, on just like on the ceasefire being the major one. That's like the major goal of these talks. But then also on other sort of side issues like women's rights and how the Afghan political system will work, and exactly how Islamic law factors into all that. So there's a lot of big disagreements apparently between the two sides here. They have not quite hammered much of this out. However, with this, the Reuters write-up was like with the major one that I was seeing in terms of like the progress of the talks. But when I read that one, I'm a little skeptical because like they're mostly citing negotiators on the government side and not really letting anyone from the Taliban side have much of a say. So I don't think it's so totally fair to like let them just paint the whole picture, let the government side do that. But at the same time, though, like what they're saying is not that hard to believe, honestly. Like, I don't think anyone expected them to sit down and immediately hammer out a deal right away. And I kind of expected the first few weeks would kind of be rough, and that, the major thing I'm just hoping is that nobody loses their cool in this stage and like walks out on the whole thing before they can start hammering those things out. Because again, like I would expect there to be an initial period of like, disagreement and all this stuff. But as far as I understand, in the talks themselves right now, the Afghan government wants to focus on the ceasefire. They're putting that front and center in the negotiations. Whereas the Taliban kind of wants to put that on the back burner. They'd rather focus on some of the broader issues, like the political system and how that will all work. They're saying the Taliban is saying it'd make way more sense to negotiate that kind of stuff, like to figure out these more complicated issues, and then we can figure out how to stop the fighting after we get those things squared away. But unfortunately, as you were pointing to, there's been a lot of violence in Afghanistan, like even just since the talks started. Like on the first few days, you had the Afghan government saying the Taliban was still launching attacks. You kind of referenced this. I sometimes am skeptical or doubt like what the Afghan government's saying. I think sometimes they overstate casualties or they overplay certain things the Taliban does. But I think Sunday we had like a really bloody day of clashes. There was, like you said, like nearly 60 government troops killed. There was clashes all around the country too. It wasn't just like confined in one area. And there was a ton of Taliban fighters. I'd seen some reports saying 80. And then just a few days prior to that, over the weekend, the government had bombed the home of a Taliban guy and killed a bunch of civilians. I saw some reports saying up to 24. So that certainly does not help anything. Those kind of operations and attacks. Again, that number of 24, maybe that's sort of these numbers are all kind of sketchy. It's not always clear, but 24 civilians dying, that is not helpful for these talks as they go forward. So even as they are trying to work out the ceasefire here, there's still a lot of violence in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, I think that is one of the ways the Taliban kind of has leverage, is like the threat of being able to carry out attacks and ambushes and stuff. So that might actually even explain part of their reluctance to like immediately resolve the ceasefire issue, that they kind of want to keep some wiggle room a little bit before they straight up commit themselves to anything on that front. But then on the government, though, they're feeling the opposite pressure. Like they want to get the ceasefire hammered out right away, because the U.S. is set to withdraw from Afghanistan in the spring, in like April or May, and then they'll no longer have that protection. So there's like very different motivations, I think, driving both sides in the talks right now. But before I become really pessimistic, I'll give them more time. Like I think it's a little early to just like say it's all hopeless at this stage.
All right, so white pill from Will here. Um, I guess one of the things I think you bring up a good point, and just to clarify that this is just from government sources, and so it doesn't necessarily surprise me they're playing up the women's right as being a key issue, because it plays so well in the Western press that you have these backwards terrorist hillbillies, the Taliban. They're just so unreasonable, and it's the civilized Afghan government that we need to make sure, that we don't have like some FGM going on in Afghanistan, or honor killings and stuff like that. And some of this is real issues, like out in especially like the tribal areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan. I don't know as much about the first thing I said, but definitely the honor killings and stuff are an issue. And so I'm not saying there's not issues here, but it does seem to be something that maybe they're putting front and center, rather than like what a future government is going to look like, who's going to be president, what political power the Taliban will have. Maybe something they're not as interested in playing up as being a key difference, because it sounds like somewhere the Afghan government has to negotiate, rather than again just the incredibly impossible Taliban. Looking and talking about just some of the violence in the country, one of the things that just tends to happen if two sides are like engaging in talks about a ceasefire, typically fighting on the ground actually gets worse during that time. And in part it's because you get more leverage if you have more territory. Also, let's say you're some Taliban fighter, right? And your village is one that's kind of still in Afghan government control. Well, if the lines get set and then you permanently had to like live on that side of the line or something like that, you really want to take your village back. And so I think that maybe accounts for why the fighting is so widespread right now, is either it's like a personal interest like that, like you're personally trying to liberate your home village, or it's some local Taliban warlord trying to extend his fiefdom a little bit. This needs to be done soon, or else it can't be done at all. So that's one of the things that happens. And so the unfortunate thing then is that if fighting increases, you're more likely to run into a scenario where either the numbers get so bad that one side ends up pulling out, or something happens like you end up killing too many civilians in one attack, or like an American gets killed, and that could throw everything into turmoil. And so for me, that seemed to be kind of the thing that stuck out most to me, which is terribly sad, right? That we're talking about 150 or so people dying in Afghanistan. This story, 19 years after 9/11 has happened, in fighting, not by a whole bunch of Americans here, but certainly fueled by the American empire. And those lives really don't impact all that much when you look at the grand scheme of things. But if a single American soldier had been killed by the Taliban, it could have caused a major shift in American policy and thrown this whole situation into discord and chaos. And that's one of the things that just concerns me looking at this, is if violence is this high, it could eventually result in not necessarily intentional, but somehow an American soldier getting killed. And unfortunately in Afghanistan, that's a life that matters a hell of a lot more than the rest of them as far as international policy goes, and how that's going to affect Afghanistan. And so Yeah, I'm worried about something like that happening with violence being this widespread.
Yeah, that is a major concern that, yeah, an American or, another type of foreign national would get caught up in one of these, but especially an American. That's a major risk that could derail this whole thing, like you're saying.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's usually only like the Western soldiers that get this treatment. Occasionally, they'll kidnap some, Western members of human rights organizations. It does get headlines, and the U.S. does work to get those people back. But nothing changes U.S. policy like a dead American soldier. But like you said, there are some NATO, international forces, and I'm sure a dead French soldier or Dutch soldier would result in about the same reaction.